Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate your taking the time at the long end of a long day, no doubt, to participate in this session this afternoon. I'm Dave Buchanan. I'm the Director of Massachusetts Programs with iCivics. And we are fortunate today to have a session focused on culturally responsive teaching. And we'll be hearing from an expert in this area. Abeer Shinnawi has joined us this afternoon to share some of her expertise in her work with reimagining migration. And you'll be hearing some more about that organization and her work in just a moment. So to get us started here, I'd like to just very briefly introduce myself here. As I said, I'm the Director of Massachusetts Programs and oversee much of the professional development as well as some of the advocacy work of iCivics, as well as closely working with the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition, which has been very successful in advocating for the state civics law, as well as continued funding to support implementation of that law. So previous to all that, I was a teacher for many years in standing in the shoes of many of you who are joining us this afternoon. Feeling your pain some of these days as well. So again, appreciate your being with us this afternoon. Just in terms of getting us oriented for today's session, a couple of notes here about the usual Zoom routines here. Obviously, we're recording this session. We'll be posting the recording on our website, the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition website, that is. We're going to ask you to stay on mute unless we invite you to unmute, and we may do that later on during the Q&A session. So there will be time to have some participation. Feel free, of course, to include any comments or questions in the chat at any time, and we'll be circling back to those when we have an opportunity to do that during the session. And again, if you have some tech issues, I think we're all learning to adjust to some of that. Do try turning off your video if you're having some glitches on that, and hopefully that will resolve the issue. You can also call in if you need to. So I will also note that we'll be including here a set of links to the materials for today. So included in all that is a link to all of the resources that Abeer will be presenting this afternoon, as well as some links to the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition website, and also to a report about the state of civic education in Massachusetts that we'll be referring to in just a moment. For those of you who are not familiar with the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition, we are a group of organizations of about over 40 organizations now that came together about 4 years ago to advocate for what was then a bill to improve civic education in Massachusetts. That has since become the civics education law as of 2018. And as I said earlier, we've been really fortunate in advocating successfully for continued funding from the state to ensure effective implementation of that law. Still more work to do, but some good success already on that front. Just to point out as well, on our website, we do have a number of resources that can be really helpful for all of you as educators. And if we have some folks who are students and parents perhaps on this call this afternoon, there are materials there for you as well. Those are all broken out by grade level to be as useful as possible. And we also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to, where we share a lot of resources on particularly pressing issues for the field these days. So we try to stay tuned into that and be as responsive as possible to the needs of the field. So do consider registering with our website so you can receive that newsletter and stay in touch with some of our work. And we'd welcome you to consider even joining the coalition as well. So very briefly here, about a year ago, there was a report released, a collaborative effort by the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education by CIRCLE, which is the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, as well as folks from Boston University Wheelock School of Education, that identified, that really surveyed the landscape of civic education in Massachusetts And there were a number of recommendations that came out of that. And we are trying to tailor these sessions of this webinar to really address some of the shortfalls and some of the areas of need that were identified in that report. Among them, and some of the recommendations from that report, are that we need to focus more on equitable implementation, that there was attention particularly to high needs districts, and to supplying funding as well as professional development and additional supports, particularly to those districts. Also continuing PD, particularly for elementary teachers, and also to address particular gaps in middle school and high school. A big need, particularly for administrators, to get the support they need. There's been a lot of neglect of civic education over many years, and many administrators, quite understandably, just are not familiar with the effective practices and whatnot that go into delivering this material in an effective way. So we're trying to provide some support for that, as is the state. And also, again, the focus on the elementary grades, that we like to think about civics as a responsibility pretty much in every course, actually, but certainly for every grade level. So thinking about a K-12 spectrum of civic education. And you'll see that in the course of the series of these webinars that we'll have this year, we'll be addressing some of that through some of those sessions coming up, and I'll talk about those in a little bit later. So that's some of the focus that we're really honing in on in these webinar sessions, and hope to address at least some of that in the session today. So this session was really designed to focus in on a presentation from Reimagining Migration, with Abeer presenting her expertise and some of her work around all of that. We are also orienting it so that there'll be some time for some participation, some Q&A, some discussion toward the end. So again, if you're just joining us, feel free to insert any questions or comments in the chat as we move through the presentation, and we will be circling back to those toward the end of the session this afternoon. So I just want to really frame up the discussion this afternoon in Abeer's presentation by thinking about the challenge that we have before us. For many years, certainly culturally responsive education has been a challenge for all of us in education for really decades. Certainly the need for that has become even more acute in recent years, excuse me. So we are particularly trying to focus in on what are some effective strategies to best address the needs that are currently before many of you in the classroom and those of you supporting teachers in schools. So we're really fortunate to have with us this afternoon Abeer Shinnawi, who has deep expertise in this and has done a lot of work with this, with reimagining migration. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Abeer to take it from here and to introduce herself and get you all oriented in some more detail to what her organization does. Abeer, thank you again for being here this afternoon.
Thank you, Dave, for inviting our organization, for being here. I think civics doesn't get the recognition it deserves. And so I think this is a very, very important session. I would also like to preface by saying, please put any questions you have in the chat. If I'm speaking too fast, let me know, because I could be a fast talker. And again, thank you, Dave, for having us here. So I am the Associate Director of Programming for the nonprofit organization Reimagining Migration, located out of Boston. I say I telecommute because I'm in the Baltimore area, but I'm also a transplant here. Speaking of migration, I'm originally from Chicago. My job is to support network of partner organizations in schools, whether it's a public school, parochial, private school, we do all of it. I do professional development as I do here, but as I've done for other organizations and schools. I also have a curriculum background. My background is in education. I taught middle school, which is the best school. I know a lot of people don't like middle school, but I love middle school. I think it also gets a bad rap. I did 7th and 8th grade, especially American history, which I really, really love teaching. I did that for, oh my God, I've been in education for almost 18 years as well. But my last 2 years before I came to Reimagining my background was in curriculum development, which I really love to do. And today we'll talk a little bit about how we can really zhuzh up, as we would say. And I know Lexi's on here, she says that too. Zhuzh up your curriculum to make it more relatable to your students. But when we talk about culturally relevant, we're talking about all students. I think culturally relevant education also gets a bad idea that you're just talking about particular groups of students. And everything that you learn here, although our organization is focused on immigrant and migrant students and their families, everything that you learn here can apply to all students as well, because we need all students to learn. And it's important for all of our students to understand the world that they live in as well. So our goals today, we are going to use a learn, link, and lead. I'm going to introduce participants to our reimagining migration, Reimagining Migration Culturally Responsive Toolkit. Now, I was going to shorten it to CRT, but I know that will put red flags up because there's other CRTs that people are talking about. So I'm going to keep saying it, Culturally Responsive Toolkit. Curriculum resources and the amazing Project Zero, who when I found out about Project Zero, I fell totally in love. And if you know a little bit about Project Zero, that's great. If you don't know anything about Project Zero, I hope you walk away with a lot more that you can learn about them, because they are amazing thank you routines that we implement as well. Link, we're going to explain how the resources allow teachers and administrators to give deeper dives into their own work and curriculum. And I love the fact that David is talking about administrators, because we always think of teaching and curriculum on, you know, that little insular level of teachers, but what do the higher ups do? Because everything they say and they want to implement trickles down. And if the more knowledge that they have about what they want teachers to implement, the stronger their school climate is going to be. So it's for teachers and educators, deep dives in their own work and curriculum, and hopefully lead a discussion of the importance of using what we call windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. I know that's an ELA reference. I'm stealing it. ELA doesn't get to take everything. But seriously, windows, doors, windows, mirrors, and sliding doors, which I'll explain later. And if you're familiar with it, that's great. To represent students in the curriculum, to really develop a strong school climate. And when you look at our culturally responsive toolkit, we have this really amazing piece that shows what level you're on. And I also want to let everybody know that we're all on a very different learning journey. Some people may not know much about being culturally responsive. Some people may know a little, some people may know a lot. So this is an opportunity for you to really gauge yourself and see where you fall on the spectrum. How much do you know and you want to improve? Or how much do you not know and you're also willing to improve as well? So there's no judgment here. And we're, again, as educators, we're always on this learning path. So I hope everybody walks away with something that they can implement in their classrooms or their schools. So reimagining migration, we always look at migration as an iceberg. And I have to give this to our executive director, Adam, who has this amazing vision of how he looks at things. And this is really how people look at life. You only see the top part of what's going on, like if it's success, if it's somebody who's doing really well, if it's an organization that's successful. We also look at immigration and migration this way. You only see the top part. When they're here, when they're in their communities, what's going on, whether it's positive or negative. But we never really dig deeper and want to look into the concept of immigration and migration on a personal level, but also on a societal level. So we look at migration as an iceberg. What is below the surface? And that's what we always want to tackle. What was life like before migration? Culture, language, relationships, but also what was life like? We always get the stereotype they're refugees or they were poor and they came here because they wanted more wealth, but that's also a big stereotype that people really need to overcome. So what was people's life like before migration in their countries? And when you speak to students, especially, look at the joy in their voice when they tell you about the life that they had before they came here. Oh, they miss this person, or they miss going to that store, they miss seeing this thing over there. Reasons why people leave their homes. This is very important because it's also in the public that people just want to up and leave their house and they come over and they want to take over X, Y, and Z. But there are also reasons, whether it's choices, whether it's pressure, whether it's environment, whether it's political, whether it's religious. What are some of those reasons that we need to understand why people leave their homes? And migration can also mean why people leave their homes within the country. Again, I'm a transplant from the Midwest to the East Coast. There were a lot of changes that I had to adapt to when I moved here as well. The ambiguous state, laws, asylum, refugees, mixed family documentation, all of that, how does that also impact a student's life and their environment and their lived experience? But also, how are they interacting with other people when they're at school, when they're around their friends, especially if they're undocumented? That adds another stress and another layer to students and their families. Conditions in the new land. What is it like when they came here? What was it like? What was the adjustment period like? I always love telling the story of my mom, who's been here for over 50 years, right? And when I asked her, I was like, Yama, how did you learn English? And she said she learned English by watching soap operas. Erica Kane, all my children, her favorite. But that's how that's how she adjusted. She didn't have anybody to teach her. She knew she had to learn fast, but what was the adjustment period like? It's fascinating to hear how resilient and how amazing people can really just adjust so fast. And you take that for granted when you've been living in the same country your entire life. And especially people who speak English, you can go anywhere in this world and speak English, but it's different when you don't speak the language to come and have to speak another language. So what's the adjustment period like? And I love the concept of reimagining migration, where we say, we put the onus on the communities to help people adjust, as opposed to the reverse, where people come in and it's like, I don't know anything. What's the community doing to help people adjust and open up those opportunities for them? And finally, local stories of migration and global patterns, perspective, unique, universal. We can agree to disagree. And although ideas and how people have come to this country are different, what are the connecting factors as well? What is it that's very similar, even though people come from such diverse backgrounds? What is so similar in their experiences that we can honor and tell in order for us to really build more inclusive societies? So we also use our amazing learning arc, which is very culturally responsive. It's a very culturally responsive tool because you look at migration as a whole. And I always say this, like, education, unfortunately, has become teaching in silos. You only teach social studies, or you teach ELA, or you only teach math, and there's no cross-curricular or any cross-content with it. When you look at our learning arc, you're able to really dig deeper into the entire concept of migration. Moving stories, we always like to start with people telling their stories, and people are like, well, my family has been here for like 200, 300, 400 years since, some people can trace them back to the Mayflower. They still have a story to tell. Everybody has a story to tell. What makes yours unique? What's yours and what's mine? And we talked about understanding migration and those pieces from the iceberg, but all of those pieces, I think we tend to forget to teach them, but they also humanize the experience. We want people to understand that migration is something that people have been doing since, man started walking on 2 feet, or persons started walking on 2 feet. So what is it that you could really understand about their migration? And for today, I think the most important piece is turning to action. Although students feel sometimes that they can't do much because they can't vote, they're actually mistaken. They need to understand that civic action is the pathway to making change, whether they're in 5th grade or whether they're graduating from college. They have a role to play. And we want our students to understand that there are ways that they can take what they want that's really dear to their heart and make it come to light. And so we do the training action piece, because how are all of those connected? If you can't learn about something and make an impact, we really want something to be for future generations to come. So these are just some ideas about supporting and why it's important to support immigrant origin youth. Immigrant origin children are the fastest growing segment in school populations as well. We see that also with the influx, not just of refugees, but also migrants and immigrants coming in. So although they arrive into the school and the classroom, and they're really enthusiastic to learn and to sit here and want to be part of the culture or the community that they're in, unfortunately, again, it's undermined social hostility, divisive rhetoric, hate, and anti-immigrant bias, which we've seen in the last couple of years that's happening. So what ends up happening is, unfortunately, a lot of these students don't make it through high school. And a lot of them would either end up dropping out and just getting a job. But they're in the beginning, they're really, really interested and they're really excited to be there. But then all of the other elements that come to play really kind of turns them off, unfortunately. So we have a bigger challenge for us to create those inclusive environments. They're among the most likely to be missing or disengaged from education during the pandemic for various reasons as well. When you're in the classroom, sometimes the systems that are in place help them more, but then we don't know what's going on with them at home, just like with all other students, but they are also most likely to be disengaged during the pandemic. And they're also targets of overlapping prejudices as people, as members of immigrant families, as young people of color. But another layer that I add to this is think of the intersectionalities when you think of your students who are immigrant and migrants. And I always give the example of, if you have a Black male student in your classroom, you have the concept that he's a male, that he's Black, but what if he's Muslim? And what if his parents came from, another country and he speaks another language? So their targets could be so many intersections and overlapping that we really have to dig deeper as to what it is, because when you have those interlapping intersections, it makes it harder for students also to connect to their schools. And we need to create that inclusive environment with our students. Sorry. So again, I spoke about Project Zero. We'll be using a lot of the thinking routines from Project Zero into the activities that we do. It's also on the resource sheet, and you can go to their website and just check out. It's very comprehensive, and it's a great resource for anybody to use to dig deeper into anything that they're doing with their students. So we're going to start with an activity, and I always tell people you can either put it in the chat or speak it into existence. Are they able to speak, Dave, or are mics turned off totally? Just in case.
Yep, you can certainly ask people to unmute.
Great.
Abeer.
Thank you. So I'm going to show an image, and I want you to just tell me what comes to mind when you see this image, or what are you thinking when you see this particular image? What comes to mind when you see this black and white image? Family caretaking, okay. Change, okay. Where's the father? And moving, traveling, generational sessions, Europe. Travel wearing, okay. A lot of easy concepts, and we're making those ideas just from the picture that traveling, the father is missing, we don't see them, we don't see the father in this picture. Do we know if they have a father deceased, or is the father waiting for them on the other side? Yes, multi-generational. I like the concept of Europe, right? Because whenever we think of immigration in the past, Europe, and which I think it's a very interesting concept as well. Adam says, I always wonder about similarities, differences between folks coming to the US today. Yeah, you're ahead of us, Adam. Thanks. So here's this image. So we have this is from Ellis Island at the turn of the 20th century, which is true. And again, I want to preface Europe because that is majority of the people who came into Ellis Island, but I just discovered something new about Yemeni immigrants who were recruited by Ford to Detroit, Michigan, because they were famous shipbuilders in the 1920s, but we don't hear that story either as well. So then I'm going to give you this image. What comes to mind when you see this image? Now it's in color. What is this image? It'll remind you of what comes to mind when you think of this image. Crowded, caretaking, maybe in the hands of the adult. Things, people we carry, yep. Recent migration, South America, Middle East, there we go. Now we're changing the demographics a bit, right? Human migration has always been a part of our American story. Very nice. Border crossing. Contemporary. Crowd of people. Child was like, what's going on? Or they're probably like, I want to be in the picture. They are on foot, right? Very different than this other image. So, if you put these two pictures together, what you're looking for a better life, absolutely. We're hoping. And is that any different than the image that I showed at the beginning, right? And this is great from the Project Zero. What's the same? If you talk to your student, what looks the same? And all of you said pretty much the same thing, better life. They have the crowd of people, they have items with them, although where they came from was different, they're still coming from another country. What's different could be the time periods, but also what do we gain when we learn and we look at migration in America from the black and white picture to the colored picture? What is something that we can gain when we use this as an example? Perspective, past and present. Who are they and from where? Yes. Transcends time. How similar, yes. How similar things can be, the past. Recognition of historical through lines. Yes, exactly. So although, and I always tell people, all the faces may look different, the stories are still the same. We don't know much about this family in the black and white because it's been past, but maybe they were fleeing persecution, or maybe they were coming and then they came here on boat, but then they have to walk across another border. We don't know that story, but we know that their stories are the same, that they came here for a particular reason. They are here now. And how are we going to honor both of their stories? And just because something happened 100 years ago, and the faces may be different, but what we gain is learning the perspective of what migration, how it really impacts our society as well, and what work we still have to do in this country. And you gain contributions, global perspectives, talents. Yes, exactly. And I think that's very important for students to know the global perspectives. They're similar, but not exactly the same. Correct. So again, this goes under our learning arc of how you can sit here and you can look through migration. And again, like Adam is saying, we honor differences by digging deeper into the lives of people who came before us and people who are still coming, and then eventually helping our students turn all of this into action and working on things to make inclusive societies. So we have our Moving Stories campaign, and as we saw in our learning arc, we have 3 very different pieces to it, and we have questions that can help you dig deeper. And these are just a sample. So for Moving Stories, we ask the question, what ways do stories of migration help us understand who we are, right? As a people, as a community, as a society. How can we approach the sharing of stories of migration with understanding and compassion? We always think of immigration, migration as something that's polarizing or very politicized, but how can we look at it with understanding and compassion? And similar to those 2 images is the fact that we also romanticize the concept of immigration and migration from the past. How are we still using that for today as well? And then understanding migration. There are 3 parts: life before migration. Like I said, what was life before the journey? Why do people leave their homes? Ask your students that question. It really helps them understand that global perspective deeper. The journey, what do people experience as they move? Of course, things are very different now by how people come, but if we're talking about people who are fleeing their countries and they're going from one country to another, whether it's by boat or whether it's by plane, what was their experience like? But I love the question, how do borders impact people's lives? Just in that picture alone, we knew that there was maybe something dealing with the border, but how does that impact people's lives as well? And then the adjustment. What are the public stories of migration? What do we hear about immigrants and how they are when they come here, and what they're contributing to society, and how are they adjusting in the conditions of the new land? And finally, turning into action, which I personally love. What issues related to migration do we care about and why? Some kids may have a direct connection. Some people may not, but some people may have a connection somehow or another, and why is it important to them? What can we learn from individuals and groups who have addressed migration in the past? History is always, it's not just totally linear, but it's also cyclical. And I love the quote that says, history doesn't repeat itself, humans do. So what have people done in the past that have addressed those issues? And what can students and children do to really continue that legacy or even improve upon it? And how might we use our voice and spheres of influence to create sustained, inclusive, welcoming environments? And that's the whole point of the turning to action is, again, although students think they may not vote, being able to vote and make some change, how can they use their voice in order for them to create a change within their communities? So there are similar and different challenges for students who are immigrant or migrant students as well. So they're shared with their marginalized peers, of course. Parent education, work conditions are pretty similar. Unfortunately, their socioeconomic and the racialization, and going back to my giving the example of the intersectionality as well. We give the assumption that they're mostly from this country or they're mostly from this particular group. How they're different from their marginalized peers, family experiences of migration are different. Of course, language actualization is a challenge, especially if they speak 1 or even more than 1 or 2 languages. And knowing how to navigate the world that they're in. Before I came to Reimagining Migration, I worked with a large public school district here in Maryland. And as a resource teacher, I started a small mentoring group for girls who were from either Muslim backgrounds or Arab backgrounds, and for them to kind of become more familiar with how to navigate the world. It's very hard for them. And I chose girls specifically because I think, especially girls who cover like me, it's hard for them to navigate and it's hard for people to accept them. So I started that mentoring group, and it was a lot of fun, but they really appreciated it because it's just somebody telling them how things are. So kids who are from immigrant migrant groups, like from their marginalized peers, if they're not from here, they also have to use that extra piece for becoming acculturated to what's going on. And of course, growing xenophobia. Unfortunately, that's a continuing trend, but then add that to their intersectionality of their lived experience. Their resiliency, we can talk about them for days. Immigrant optimism, of course, they've come here and they're ready to start a great life. They have great work ethic, value of education. A lot of times teachers kind of get turned off by how parents value or look at the education system, but that's also very cultural. They're really trusting you and taking care of their students, and they want to see that. So they do value education regardless of how it's looked at. Cohesive families. A lot of families do have more multi-generational people living with them, which is also an advantage for their students and for the families as well. Bilingual advantages, that's also should always looked at as an asset. And we were having this conversation the other day with people who are, English language learners, where, the communication workspace, just thinking as a country as a whole, when you're able to speak in more than one language, how kids can code switch, but also their abilities to use that to their advantage for a lot of other areas in their life and their lived experience as well. And a person who is bilingual, I like to do that as well, because then you can speak and people don't know what you're saying. Some ways to make a big difference. Especially newcomers, they feel like they're isolated from their US born peers. And I see that a lot because me being born and raised here, and I see people who come here from the Middle East, they kind of gravitate towards people who have been born and raised here because they can help them navigate. But also you want to understand that the disconnect from the newcomers from students, unfortunately, is, there's that our unconscious bias that comes with it, right? A lot of limited understanding of where these kids are coming from, whether it's socioeconomic or their socio-emotional challenges as well, what trauma they have brought with them, and addressing those traumas. Many have poor opinion of parents. And again, we've seen it where parents are, the teachers like the students, but the parents are, they've got this different opinion about the parents because they don't return their phone calls, or they just have these other perceptions of them. And I think the last one is more important. The most important one is teachers don't receive PD simply on English acquisitions for kids who are speakers of another language, or just knowing how to address the needs of social emotional learners and the cultural relevance that is needed to address the needs of a lot of these students, because we can't deny that a lot of these kids come with a particular culture and background that also needs to be respected. And I know there's a lot of comments. I'm not able to see all of them. Adam, kids who are bilingual often learn how to navigate different spaces better than their monolingual peers. And I think it's also something that they're, I don't want to say forced, but that's the environment that they live in, and other things that they have to do, especially if they're translating for people at home. So we're talking about culturally responsive teaching, but what does it really look like? So this is a great video from actually a Native American or indigenous teacher. She's part of the Sioux tribe, who explains what culturally responsive teaching should look like in the classroom. So I'd like you to use the word, phrase, sentence from Project Zero. As you watch the video, what word captured your attention or struck you as powerful? What phrase that moved or engaged or provoked you? And what sentence that was meaningful to you that you felt captures the core idea of the video? Again, a word, a phrase, and a sentence. It's about a 3-minute video. Make sure, let me just stop sharing for a second and see if I shared my audio. 1 second, let me go back. Okay, great. And here we go.
We're not just talking about teaching about American Indians, especially for Native students. There are indigenous methodologies of educating young people around the world, and how important those were, and what can we learn from those that might be valuable to reincorporate, back into the education system paradigm, really, that we have now. And that's especially important for Native communities themselves. We're working towards greater sovereignty and greater self-determination, and education is a major vehicle towards that end. Culturally responsive teaching is really about what we teach and how we teach diverse populations. It's a combination of pedagogy, curriculum, actual instructional delivery, the attitudes and beliefs I think that we bring to the classroom. Really, it's about a responsibility to know, understand, respect the various backgrounds, cultural heritage, whatever it is that students bring to the classroom, to have an awareness of that and to utilize students' prior knowledge, which comes from their families and their homes and their communities, and in my case, even tribes, and building off of that. I think culturally responsive teaching can be most clearly seen in the relationships that teachers have with their students. I think it's also demonstrated in how we teach, the instructional strategies that we employ in the classroom, as well as, what we teach, the material, how inclusive are our textbooks and the additional materials, our lesson plans that we bring to students every day. When you have a teacher that shows you respect, builds relationships, works at understanding, our communities and our cultures and our identities, that can really create a circumstance where children will go anywhere and imagine new possibilities and problem solve and really become, the kind of young people that we need and we want in our communities. One thing that's very important to me when working with teachers is to understand and reflect on the sort of cultural space, the cultural identity that you bring to the classroom and how that presents itself, how that is really what children see and hear and interact with on a daily basis. And without being culturally responsive, you're never presenting anything else in that space for children that desperately want to have a sense of belonging. They want to feel empowered. They want to feel as though they're valued and respected in their classrooms and in their schools. And it isn't always easy, and it's not always comfortable. You have to stretch and grow and be willing to sometimes get things wrong and ask questions. When you see that sort of inclusive environment, you know it. You just know it right off the bat by the ways the students and teachers are interacting. It just becomes so enlivened. And that's just always the best spaces to see.
Let me go back. Trying to go back. So we were doing word, phrase, excuse me, enlarging the screen, sentence, and let's see if we have anything in. All right. So yes, sake of time would kind of just speak it out. So we have responsibility, understand, see relationships to how we teach. Yes. And relationships also, like I read this the other day on Twitter. It's so true. Relationships are very important, but we also need strong instruction. So she talked about curriculum, but she talked about it where it really is everywhere that you can see. It's not just a 1 month thing, or it's a 1 day thing, or we highlight certain groups of people, right? Or a certain person. It has to be all encompassing. And especially when you teach at a school that you may not live in, go to the local grocery store, go to places that students also frequent. And when the kids see you there, they really know that you're also invested in the classroom. It's not only just in the curriculum, but also how are you showing up in the areas that they live in, because that's important for students to see as well. Reflect on your own self, what we teach and how we teach it. And she said, you may get it wrong. And I know we live in an environment right now where it could be very scary as an educator to want to do something and make a mistake. But when you have the support and the right supports, then you're able to learn. And like I said in the beginning, we're all in the learning journey. I don't know everything about everyone and everybody doesn't know everything about me, but getting to learn about that and seeing how you can bring your students. And I love the chat, student paradigm, education paradigm, belonging, just want to be seen. Yeah, we all want to be seen, right? And also being inclusive teaching, knowing it off the bat. So this is, I think, a great quote. Culturally responsive teaching can most clearly see the relationship with teachers have with their students, a greater community and their families and their caregivers and so forth and so on. And I think her last sentence, I think relationships are very central to all of this. If you have a strong relationship, that means you're really there to see your students as who they are and what the assets they bring to the classroom. And then you're really going to be making more of an effort to really help them see themselves, windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. So our RIM is Reimagining Migration. Our culture responsive toolkit really does a great job of having you understand exactly what you're using and how you're using it. We have a little bit of it's like a sliding scale to see how you can test yourself. And this was done, with the research from Geneva Gay, who's the guru of culturally responsive teaching. But according to her, she says the behavioral expressions of knowledge, beliefs, and values that recognize the importance of racial and cultural diversity in learning, and it is contingent on seeing cultural differences as assets. And that's why it's so important to have culturally responsive teaching, is you look at it as assets, and also what makes this country so unique. No matter where else you go, it's not going to be the same as what you're going to get here in the United States. So what are the assets that they bring in order for you to create that inclusive environment? And again, contingency those assets in the communities where individuals and heritages are valued. So of course, we talk about mirrors, windows, and sliding doors. Mirrors, students see themselves. And how are they going to see themselves in the curriculum? As she said, it's not easy, and it's not going to be something that you'll probably be able to do every single day, but it's something that you want to work on as well. Windows, how are students able to see the lives of other students in the curriculum that you're creating? What are the windows and the pathways? And then the sliding doors, how are kids able to come in and out of those lived experiences? What are they able to learn? What are they able to experience? And also, how are they able to develop a better understanding? But also the last bullet, build critical intellectualism and student identity and their content through activism and self-advocacy, capacity building. And we live in such a digital world that kids really know more about other people, but how are we able to have them learn about that lived experience as well? So we have the different levels and approaches in our culturally responsive toolkit that you can take a look at, which I'll skim through. And then you are more than welcome. It's in that resource sheet. But level one is just what we call the contributions approach. Code switching for understanding. You're talking about major historical figures, but we're talking about, heroes, holidays, Black History Month, Indigenous Peoples Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, all of those. So that's what we call level one, as the contributions approach. Level two, the additive approach. You do the contributions, but we're going to throw in a reading or a text. We'll have a couple of lessons or lectures and discussions, and a classroom with multicultural perspectives. You have that, but it's not ingrained in their day-to-day atmosphere of the school. Level three, transformative approach. Now, when you're past level 1 and 2, you get to level 3, where you're able to see the multicultural perspectives in your classroom as well, and introduce essential ideas to reflect on the complex interactions, whether it's racial, ethnic, or religious. Now, if you're in multicultural or you're a culturally responsive guru, you're on level 4, which is social action approach. And this one is difficult because we're still learning what it means to be civic minded, right? We're still learning to understand what does it mean, what does it look like? But these are really helping students find existing social problems from multicultural perspective, because studies now have shown that kids identify themselves not anymore as identity politics, but as social justice politics. So a white kid in rural Iowa may gravitate towards the Black Lives Movement because he's not going to identify as Black, but he identifies that social justice piece. So that's what kids are doing now. We need to get past just that identity politics, because kids don't do the identity as much anymore, and they really identify with that social justice piece. So a couple of resources. This is definitely the structure of the curriculum, enable students to view concepts, and that's where you get to the students. Windows, mirrors, and sliding doors is what do they see in the curriculum with fidelity and with the right resources that shows the lived experiences of the different multi-ethnic groups in your school. So a couple of examples, and all of these are on the resource sheet, and I'm just going to go through them so we can get to question and answer. Where you can start is our Emma Lazarus project, and it's a great one because what your students will do is examine, interpret primary sources. We love primary sources. We love it a lot, right? Make connections between past and present. And Emma Lazarus wrote the beautiful poem, The New Colossus for the Statue of Liberty. Use their voice to engage in issues that matter to them. And then they write the poem to express what it means to them to be American, right? What is it to be an American? So the Emma Lazarus is a really good one to start because you start with the Statue of Liberty, which is image of America. Everyone around the world knows and understands the Statue of Liberty. What does it mean to be an American? And you get kids to really dig deeper into the sessions. And what you have is you have 3 different ways that we have the curriculum is really mapped out. Number 1, you're discovering the new Colossus, gives you how many minutes, what you're able to do. Number 2, there are different pathways through the archive. You can watch the film. There's some lessons. You can design your own as well. It's also in partnership with the American Jewish Historical Society. And finally, number 3, writing the new Colossus. They start and create their own new Colossus, expressing their vision and ideals about America. So what better way to start with some civic action by asking kids, what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to be, to me? Another great resource we also have is, so this is a question we always like to start when you're too young to vote. How can you make your voice heard? I think the civic poetry unit, yes, it is. So when you're too young to vote, how can you make your voice heard? So we have this great resource about these beautiful young ladies and their beautiful dresses talking about, well, I'm gonna ask this question. Does anybody know why they're all dolled up and look all fancy schmancy? Anything, any kind of hint or idea? Let's see, and Adam, you can't respond because you know. Ani, what is it? They're dressed up because,
because it's in Cincinnati, and I learned from you guys, and it was no, it's amazing. We use it all the time because we are trying to create a curriculum for Latinx audiences.
I love it. Thank you, Ani. Thank you for being here. I love seeing you. So yes, this is what these are. Some beautiful ladies in their quinceañera dresses, and we all know Latin American women turn 15. This is their time to shine. So what they did was they took the opportunity of the quinceañera, instead of putting the spotlight on them, they used it to use a protest of the Capitol in Texas. I'm not going to give it away because I want you to go to our website and check it out. But what better way to show kids that you have these young women who took such a pivotal moment in their life to really protest something that meant dear to them, but this lesson also fostered civic knowledge. It also talked about nurturing civic attitudes, relationships between individual groups, and identity. But also, if you check anything out, the 10 questions for change makers is really groundbreaking. It's a great way to have students understand what it means to be a change maker as well. And as Adam says, culture is a form of civic power. Absolutely. Going back to the culture responsive teaching, why is it important to incorporate your culture into the things that you do in your day-to-day life? So that's another great resource to use as well, which are all on the resource pages. So basically, if you're looking for an inclusive environment, you need to embrace, infuse, and display. Embrace the diversity of the languages and identities in your schools, infuse it in your school rituals, in your daily routines, everything that you can touch upon, whether it's the morning announcements, whether if you have posters in your classroom that are multilingual, whether you have images from places that represent the students, everything, have them feel like you value their diversity. Display it, again, hallways, public spaces, presentations, and school communities. So I would like to end off by saying your students may be the first. So does anybody know who this fabulous lady is? Has anybody seen her in the news? She was recently in the Boston Globe. Anybody but Adam Strom can respond. All right, so I'm going to give it away because for the sake of time, I really want to get to question and answer. Let's see what we got. Stop picking on me. I'm not picking on you. It's true. You're like that star student. So make a long story short, and I was going to show the video, but I'm just going to show the clip, and the video is also in the resources. So this sister, as we would call it, oh, there you go. It did go in there. She's a Somali refugee who becomes South Portland's first Muslim mayor, right? So she's Somali, she's a refugee, she's female, she's Muslim, she's a hijabi, but she's the first one in a 90% white city. and they chose her to become the mayor. Now, she's the first in the country to be the first Somali female mayor ever. And I say your students may be the first because what she says is so important about civic action. She says, and also not for immigrant, first generation or Black people, but also young white individuals who may have been afraid to don't want to be part of civic action because in the past, or they say, but you have to say, yes, if you can do this, yes, you can do it. We really, really need you, each and every one of you. And she used her identity and who she was to be a bridge builder. You know, she didn't care where she was. She was there to make sure that the community that took her in is a better community for everybody else. But again, think about your students. How could they be the first at something, just as this lady did, who came here and she's also a social worker. So that's how we need to look at our students as what are the assets that they bring? How are you going to bring that out with your culture responsive teachings? And what is it that they can share with the rest of the world and starting with your school and the community? And we have discussion now, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm sorry I rushed through it, but time always escapes me. And I'm open for questions and comments. Thank you for having me.
Abeer, thank you so much. And you did an excellent job of keeping Adam in control too.
I have a question, Abeer. I
Yes.
asked you in your
Sorry.
chat box.
Mhm.
Just wanted to ask, because I know you just a little bit brushed away from the cultural relevant versus
Mhm.
cultural responsive.
Mhm.
And why did you choose either or? I'm just asking because I know many people would have the similar question in their mind.
So culture responsive really shows up in the curriculum. You're responding to your school environment, your school, the population in your school, and to the students. So not to confuse it, of course, culturally relevant is pretty much the same. I just like to use responsive because it's an action. Right? It's something that you're actually doing and you're showing within your curriculum, and it digs deeper than, as you saw, the different levels that we have. So you're being responsive to your environment because you may not have a school that is quote unquote as diverse as other schools. So how are you going to make it culturally responsive to that particular school as well and to the needs of your students? Does that help, Ani?
No, thank you. I know the answer to it, but I just thought that it would be a good question to
No.
ask.
Great, thank you.
So Abeer, there was a question earlier. Is it appropriate to shine a light on immigrant students to then share part of their culture in a lesson?
So that's a very good question. You really have to understand what the relationship is you have with the student, number one. Number two, we don't always want to have students be quote unquote the spokesperson for a particular topic or culture. You need to make sure that they're comfortable doing it. How that happens is, of course, through the relationships. And if the student is not comfortable, how are you going to be able to have other students learn about their amazing experience without really shining so much light on them? Because we also have to take into consideration what trauma they may come with them and how it is if they are the experience, and we don't want that to resurface. So it really depends on the relationship you have with your students and how comfortable your students are. And if they're not, then you could probably do it in generality about the immigrant experience. And we use our moving stories, which has been very helpful for people to use that as well. And it's on our website to use guided questions to help students share their experiences.
So Abeer, let's do one more question. We are running
Sure.
short on time here, but you have so much to share here. It's really valuable to hear
Sure.
your experience. I am wondering if you want to just talk briefly about your experience in working in schools,
Mhm.
reimagining immigration, reimagining migration, I should say.
Mhm.
And just in terms of how has that looked different at different grade levels? And we're obviously not going to do every grade, but how might it look different in elementary grades as opposed to middle and high school?
So it really also depends on what the focus of the content is on each grade level. Unfortunately, and I say this strongly, elementary doesn't have a huge focus on social studies or civics. So when we deal with elementary schools, we're talking about something that may be on a very basic level. What is migration? What is immigration? What is the story? What is the history? You can't dig deeper because they don't have that foundational knowledge. And so we work on where their content and their standards are and what they want to focus on, not overwhelming the teachers or the students as well. We do more typically through ELA at elementary, yes. But also with middle school and social studies, you can dig deeper. We've done work where it has been curriculum that focuses on, because there you get content specific. And when you're content specific, it's much easier to focus on a particular piece of their curriculum in order for you to work on. So an example would be, we are working with some schools in Massachusetts, and they're working on their civics curriculum. So we're coming in and we're helping them create something that's more culturally responsive to the changing demographics of their students and how they can see their students within the civics curriculum as well, using various court cases and using various scenarios of things that have happened historically in the United States. So it really depends also where the school wants to begin, what age level, and the content that they're focusing on.
All right, so Abeer, thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation that, it's given us so much to think about and to think about how we might incorporate this into our own practice in our schools and in our work with teachers and students. I'm just really struck by how you've really highlighted how important it is to think of the students in our school population, those who are immigrant students and whatnot, as bringing assets to the school rather than deficits. For a long time, I think we've looked at this as a sort of deficit model, and it's really, I think, a really positive turn to be thinking of it in terms of an asset to our school community, for sure. And I just also want to just underline the way you've also emphasized the connection to civic education, particularly. Obviously, a lot of what you've presented today applies across the disciplines and across content areas, but particularly in terms of thinking about how students can take a stand and take some action on issues that are particularly relevant to them. That's a really key issue, and certainly something that is the focus of the civics law here in Massachusetts, and particularly around the civics projects. And of course, we need to be really making that outreach to our students and making sure that students, including immigrant students, are included in that and see themselves in those projects, and that they have an opportunity to really work on something that they really care about. So I know we could discuss this at much greater length and would welcome that at some point as well. But I do want to thank you today for the session this afternoon, and for all the preparation you did in making this presentation possible. Before we wrap up here, I do want to just highlight a couple of other things that are coming up with the coalition. And I hope those of you who are joining us this afternoon will consider joining the coalition. And you can certainly sign up as on our contact list to receive our newsletters and get continuing information about upcoming events. We do have some major events coming up. There is a Civic Learning Week. This will be our second annual one, first one last year, where we really highlight a lot of various topics related to civic education for an entire week. This year, we're working in partnership with a similar program in New York City. So we're hoping to have some healthy rivalry with our friends in New York City around that. But I do hope you'll join us for that, and we'll have more information out shortly about that event as well. In addition, we have continuing webinar series, this being the first in our series for this year. We've had a number in previous years, and recordings of those are available on our website. But coming up just next month on January 5th, right after we get back to school, is a session on teaching hidden histories, on teaching the histories that are too often not told in our classrooms. And again, I think we'll have a really engaging session that really, I think, ties into some of what Abeer was presenting this afternoon as well. So you'll see the other ones that are listed there. We'll have registration links available for those shortly on our website. But in closing here, I just want to share with you a couple of links. You'll see that in the chat there, I just incorporated the link to access further information about upcoming events. And also, we'd really like to get your feedback on today's session. So there's a session evaluation included there. If you just take a couple of minutes as we wrap up here to give us your feedback, that's really invaluable information for us as we do planning for future sessions. So we are at time here, and we're going to wrap up. Abeer, thank you again so much for all the preparation and for really tuning up our thinking about how we approach the issue around culturally relevant instruction. And we look forward to further engagement with you at future sessions potentially too. So
for
thanks to
having
all
us
of you as
again, Dave.
well for joining this afternoon. We are going to wrap up here, but again, hope to see you at future webinars, and all the best for the coming holiday season to all of you as well. Thank you for attending.
Good night.